Here we will see transaction state in SQL Server. Transaction state indicates how transactions go during their lifetime. It describes the current state of the transaction as well as how the transaction will be processed in the future. These states define the rules that determine whether a transaction commits or aborts. Different transaction state in SQL servers are as shown, that is active state, partially committed state, terminated state, aborted state and failed state. First is active state. This is the first state in the life cycle of transaction. A transaction is called in active state as long as its instructions are getting executed. All the changes made by the transactions are stored in the buffer in main memory. Next is partially committed state. After the last instruction of transaction has executed, it enters into a partially committed state. After entering this state, the transaction is considered to be partially committed. It is not considered fully committed because all the changes made by the transaction are still stored in the buffer in main memory. Next is failed state. When a transaction is getting executed in active state or partially committed state and some failure occurs due to which it becomes impossible to continue the execution, it enters into a failed state. Next is aborted state. After the transaction has failed and entered into a failed state, all the changes made by it have to be undone. To undo the changes made by the transaction, it becomes necessary to roll back the transaction. After the transaction has rolled back completely, it enters into an aborted state. Next is committed state. After all the changes made by the transaction have been successfully stored into a database, it enters into a committed state. Now the transaction is considered to be fully committed. After a transaction has entered the committed state, it is not possible to roll back the transaction because the system is updated into a new consistent state. The only way to undo these changes is by carrying out the another transaction called compensating transaction that performs the reverse operation. Next is terminated state. This is the last state in the life cycle of a transaction. After entering the committed state or aborted state, the transaction finally enters into a terminated state where its life cycle finally comes to an end. Here we will see working of life cycle of a transaction. Once a transaction state execution, it become active. It can issue read and write operations. Once the read write operations complete, the transaction become partially committed state. Next, some recovery protocols need to ensure that a system failure will not result in any inability to record the changes in the transaction permanently. If this check is success, the transaction commits and enters into a committed state. If the check is failed, the transaction goes to the failed state. If the transaction is aborted while it is in active state, it goes to the failed state. The transaction should be rolled back to undo the effect of its write operations on the database. The terminated state refers to the transaction leaving the system.